Good afternoon. It is afternoon. It's Friday afternoon when I'm doing this recording. And welcome to the Road to Recovery, the Road to Freedom with Mark. Well, it's interesting, sometimes word gets around and it's quite difficult for me when people I know see what I do and talk about it, I guess, because people have a certain estimation of you. They judge you. They don't mean to necessarily, but they have a certain opinion of who you are and what you do and what you think and how you act, and they like to cubbyhole you. So it's kind of very difficult when people see what you do, especially when you're spilling your guts about issues like mental health, which is what this program's all about. And I mean, it's difficult enough just sitting in front of a camera doing this, but when people are involved, it's weird and uncomfortable and to some degree embarrassing. I guess this stigma, the shame associated with mental health, there's always been this idea, especially amongst males, that to show weakness is not a terribly masculine thing to do. You've got to be tough, you've got to be strong, and in so doing you conquer all things, the strongest and the bravest, which of course is bullshit, really. And I think we are starting to come around to that realisation only in recent times, and we have started talking about issues like mental health, which seems to have become one of those favourite flavours of the month that people whip into a fervour, all this I am hope stuff. And I've been chugging away doing this for 5 years at least now, and when I first started out there wasn't a mention of things like this. Nobody was talking about this, and now it seems that everybody's jumped on the bandwagon, but I feel like we're coming off the back of a wave here, and it's now becoming less popular, and people are moving on to other chicken-licking things that they can do, like global warming or whatever flavour of the month it might be, and that kind of disgusts me, really. I hate it when people all jump on board and all care, but they only care for a little while, and then they turn their backs and walk away, and they forget all about it. And how do we give this thing legs? How do we sustain it? Well, I guess people like myself and my supporters, Arrow Radio, Wairarapa TV, people like Michael and Veronica here, who I owe so much to, and the good sponsors that help us, including New Zealand On Air. Little radio stations like this have no profile, they have no real advertising. It is really down to you to spread the good word. And I put it to you that radio stations like this are a damn sight better, a damn sight more interesting than some of the other rubbish we're forced to listen to. And media, for the most part, is a very, very shallow thing. But this radio station is a bit of an exception because it tries to empower people who would not otherwise have a voice. So I am very privileged to be in the position that I am. I'm very grateful for it. I never take this for granted. And I try and be on time and do my bit every week and see if I can help. Now, I just want to talk today about mindfulness and state of mind, which are two totally different things but interrelated, and I'll explain. When you're suffering from any kind of mental illness, you experience a lot of frustration, often a lot of anger. You find that you're very short-tempered, intolerant, and it is important to realise that that is your state of mind, that you are being affected by what's going on between your ears. And a way to help yourself, and at the end of the day, the greatest help is from yourself. And the way to help yourself is to try and be more mindful of all of the things around you. Learn to appreciate things, people, everything. And one of the things that I've tried to do, the exercise that I use, is to try and regain some degree of wanderlust, which is to say, rediscover that part in your life, like when you were a child. Everything was so new and interesting and fascinating, and I try my hardest to celebrate spring, to find joy in that new life, to let that wash over me and through me and enjoy those things so much more. And I find that this, for me at least, was a big turning point in my recovery from a very dark place. And, you know, it is important to work on your state of mind, to try and be positive. And I used to say to myself over and over in my head, I used to think positive thoughts, think positive thoughts, think positive thoughts. And once you're aware that you're spiraling into negativity, then you can break out of it. If you just let it happen, it becomes a habit and you end up in a rut. So in order to break out of that, you've got to think about being positive. And once you start thinking about being positive, you start doing positive things. Well, I've got to watch the time because, I ran out of time last week by about 3 minutes. Got to watch the clock. She's a tricky thing when you're on 28 minutes and you're trying to slot everything in. So I just like to finally finish off. This is a bit of a laugh. I just want to say a special shout out to a great friend of mine, a mentor of mine who taught me so much and gave me some great stories. Stu McNeil, thanks, mate. I know I didn't use your name. I call him the old mate, or Tom for short. And it isn't one story I wrote about you, Stu, about us. I mean, I wrote at least 4. And for those of you who don't know Stu, he is a pretty amazing fella and a great fisherman, a great hunter, and just an all-round bloody good bloke, and there's not too many of them in this world. So, I've been privileged to know him since I was a boy. And Stu, I'll send you those stories, mate. I'll handwrite some copies for you, my friend. Okay, we're going to get on to today's story, which doesn't involve my old mate. This is one from quite some time ago when I was travelling the world, and this particular one was when I was living in London. I lived there for about 5 years, and I often toured the continent as many times as I could, and I met a lot of amazing people on the road. I tried to do a lot of hitchhiking, which meant I stayed at people's homes and lived with them. Excuse me. And I got to know a lot about not just the history of their countries, but their lives and what they feel and think. And, it was astounding to me that every single place that I went to in the world, just how similar people were. They just all wanted the same things: a better future for their kids, health, education, those simple things, but everybody desires those. And yet we have wars. And why? Well, I guess because of governments. That's what it boils down to. People in power, unfortunately, don't really use it very well, and we need to encourage those people, especially our government, to do more for its people, and especially in the case of mental health. Right, time to crack on. This story is called The Longest March Home. It was winter in London, and Christmas was closing in fast. Working on the building sites was dwindling off, and I was missing home. I was slowly coming round to the realisation that I would probably never leave London, and she was to become my new home. But I didn't know anyone in London too well, other than my best mate Seedy, and he was off to Germany to see our old mate Manfred in Mannheim. I was freezing my arse off in my big old squat in South London, just off the Old Kent Road. So I went for a final pint with Seedy down the Thomas A. Becket before he headed off for Germany. I loved those pubs down the Old Kent Road. The Henry Cooper, the Green Man, the Thomas A. Becket, the Gin Palace and the Elephant Castle. But the Thomas A. Becket was my favourite in London. Many of them had gymnasiums and rings for professional boxers upstairs, and they produced some real class boxers, right up to international level. I got to know a few of the boxers who worked as bouncers for a bit of extra cash. They were hard men but real good fellas, and I watched a few of them fight for titles in places like Crystal Palace. Whilst I was having our last few ales, Seedy suggested I go to Manfred's in Germany to have Christmas with them all. We chewed the fat for a while because it was just a couple of weeks till Christmas. Also, I didn't have too much spare cash or accommodation in Mannheim. Seedy talked me into it, assuring me we'd have a great time, something to remember. How right he was. Seedy headed off before me, so I had to organise my own way over in a hurry. I didn't have any maps or much in the way of clothes or cash, but what the hell. I booked a trip on the bus from London to Dover, then the ferry to Calais, France, then a bus on to Frankfurt in Germany. From there it was a short tram ride out to Mannheim. I rang Manfred and told him I'd be at the train station at 3 p.m. Wednesday before Christmas, but ended up heading off a day earlier than I planned. On the way to Dover on the bus, I met a guy from Heidelberg who offered to let me stay at his folks' place. So we sailed over the English Channel and ended up that night in Heidelberg. I spent a wonderful, if somewhat cold and snow-covered day there. The chap's grandmother took a dislike to me and insisted I leave the next day. Some of those old Germans were strange, but I was happy enough to finally meet my old friend Manfred on the platform in Mannheim. I was so relieved to see him, and he took me back to the small flat he and Jutta shared. We had a great dinner with some friends, then got on the mulled wine. Over a few drinks, a friend of Manfred's, Brigitte, offered to put me and Seedy up for the night in a small loft in her flat. We gratefully accepted and got rolling on schnapps and vodka, then headed off to Brigitte's flat. It was snowing and really cold on the way home, and I realised my coat and clothes were not really adequate for such a cold European winter. The flat, too, was really cold, and the tiny attic she showed us was only heated by a tiny paraffin heater. The attic was half a story above the first floor in a tiny flat around a cobblestone quadrant. We hunkered down the best we could, but I had troubled dreams all night. Despite my drunken state, I kept waking up imagining rats were running over my blankets. I woke up freezing at first light and shook Seedy awake. "There were rats running over us last night, weren't there?" I asked him. "Yeah, let's get the F out of here," he said. We raced off downstairs, but the door was locked, so we headed back up to the attic, hopped out through a window and slid off the snow-covered roof down to the cobblestones below. A long way down, but it sure felt good to escape. Turns out, Brigitte had kept pet rats, but they had escaped. Then wild rats came in and bred with the pet rats living under the floor and in the walls. What a nightmare. Nonetheless, our stay in Mannheim was wonderful. We visited one or two older folks who lived through the war, and they came across as markedly different to the younger generation. Most of our days were compiled of drinking the Germans' wonderful pills and vodka and going for long walks in the snow. It was amazing to see how thick it piled up on the trees. Christmas turned out to be a pretty tame affair, but New Year's Eve was a real blast. A few of us went round, drunk as skunks, blowing out street lights with pistols which shot like starting guns. Never seen anything like it. I really liked staying with the Germans. They are an interesting and complex people, if somewhat flawed. They seem tied to their past in all of its dark and awkward ways, glorious and yet terrible. That is where the complexity comes in. It was an enlightening time. In those days, Germany was still split into East and West. A year or two later, the wall came down, and the world continued to change as it must. After New Year's, I had to head back to London. I had virtually no money left, I think about £20, and no maps or plan of how I would get back to London. Manfred dropped me about 20 kilometres out of Mannheim, and I had to hitchhike my way down through Germany, then hook right to Aachen at the border, and cross through Belgium via Brussels to Ostend, and back across the Channel to Dover and on to London. On the motorway it was cold, grey in the middle and white on the shoulders. There was ice under the snow on the shoulders of the road, which made walking down the sides very slow and difficult. Vehicles were travelling fast and no trucks seemed willing to stop. In those days I was young, fit and very strong. I could easily walk 20 kilometres in a day, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to get back to London. But the more the day wore on, the more it became apparent I'd bitten off more than I could chew. No matter how hard I tried, I could not get a lift, and I was forced to walk in the snow all day. By the time it got dark, the cold had cut through to my bones. I knew I had to find shelter, or there was a good chance I would freeze to death in the sub-zero temperatures on the motorway. I kept driving myself on until about 8 p.m. in the dark. I came across a petrol station on the side of the motorway that had a cafe and public toilets. It was so good to sit in the cafe, thaw my bones and sip on a hot coffee. All the same, it was becoming apparent I was underprepared for the journey home, and I needed to get out of there and across the border at Aachen as soon as possible. So after a cold night, sitting in the freezing public toilets and the relatively warm cafe, I was still awake at dawn, standing on the motorway outside the petrol station thumbing for a lift. Morning passed by, then the afternoon. All the trucks seemed to be heading south to Cologne, and there weren't too many cars. I got more and more cold and tired, unable to get round to the border, and I knew that I was in trouble deep. One day turned into 2, then 3. The cafe closed around 2 a.m, so I was forced to shelter in the freezing public toilets. I couldn't sleep, and the lack of food and cold started to take a huge toll on me. On the second day of my entrapment in this place, some guy ordered some Wiener Schnitzel, took one bite, looked me straight in the eye and left. If it wasn't for that meal he left behind, I probably wouldn't have survived that huge journey home. After 3 days stuck in the gas station, I knew I had to strike out or die. I walked some 30 kilometres down and round to the Aachen border. The weather warmed up enough to rain and I got saturated. Then the temperature dropped so low my clothes froze solid on my body and I thought I would freeze to death. But I drove myself on and met up with a bloke in a car at the border. He was a real nice bloke who worked for BASF in Brussels and gave me a lift from the German border to the centre of Brussels in Belgium. I slept all the way and managed to recharge the batteries and regain my resolve to get back to London no matter what. I knew that Ostend was the closest port to Brussels, but I had no map, food or money, and no idea which direction to go. I was still exhausted and I stumbled into the underground. I guessed which way to go, despite the fact I knew no Belgium. I got to the outskirts and followed what looked like a main road till sunset. It was snowing and very cold, and I was getting desperate to find respite from the freezing road. I came across an old Gothic church and pounded on its massive doors, but neither God nor his representative answered my calls, so I stumbled off down to the motorway out of Brussels. I came across a sign pointing to Gont and guessed it must be halfway to Ostend. It was too late to turn back, so I had to risk everything and walk all night, hitchhiking in the dark and the snow. The side of the motorway was slippery with ankle-deep snow. Slowly the wind and snow exhausted me as I marched on through the night. I'd only eaten one meal in about 4 days and had a few hours sleep. By 10 p.m. I was utterly exhausted. I had walked about 20 kilometres and could take no more. I found a bridge and crawled underneath to get out of the foul weather. I felt so tired, all I could think of was curling up and going to sleep. Eerily, as I started to lose consciousness, I could hear my father's voice urging me to keep going, not to fall asleep there, or I would surely die. I headed back to the motorway and was so tired I was stumbling all over the place. The traffic was light, but finally a car skidded to a stop some 200 metres in front of me. I stumbled as fast as I could up to the car, and a lady driver drove me some 20 kilometres down the motorway. Her car was so comfortable and warm. "Why did you stop to pick me up?" I asked her. "Because you looked like you needed help," was all she said to me. It was just enough to keep me going. Around 11 p.m, a bunch of guys picked me up. The car was full, and they were all pissed but full of fun. I had to lie down over their legs in the back seat with my pack over my back, uncomfortable, but another 15 kilometres closer to Gont. After that, I was utterly spent. Back out in the wind and the snow, I stumbled along, slipping in and out of consciousness. Around midnight, a bloke picked me up. He introduced himself as Peter and told me he was going through to Gont. He said I could stay with some friends of his who sold Persian carpets. I was too weak to argue, though I had the most horrible feeling I was about to meet a terrible end. We arrived at about 1 a.m. at a place called Room with a View, and I entered a dark shop and ascended a flight of stairs. At the top of the stairs I entered a huge dining room. There was an extremely long table there, covered in white linen and lit with a series of candles. About 8 people were sitting around it, and I was introduced to Marty and his wife, who owned the place. They invited me to sit down and gave me some steak, a joint, and a half a packet of menthol cigarettes. Despite my rising fear, I indulged in the sustenance offered in this most bizarre of midnight feasts. We ate, chatted and smoked into the small hours. Then Marty showed me to my room, which featured a cast-iron bath. I drew a bath and had my first soak in nearly a week, then passed out in crisp, clean linen sheets. I slept for the next 2 days and nights and slowly regained my strength. After that, I spent a couple of days wandering around that beautiful medieval town that had managed to survive the blitzkrieg of the Nazis. Then it was time for me to push on to the coast. I only had £20 left, enough to pay for the ferry crossing across the channel. I couldn't afford to pay Marty for the accommodation, but he was fine with that and dropped me off on the outskirts of town and wished me good luck. I hugged him and thanked him sincerely for being there when I needed him so badly. Those sort of things you never forget. Within 15 minutes of being dropped off, I was picked up by John, who lived just 5 minutes' drive from Ostend. He took me back to his little flat where he lived with Susan, who was dying of cancer. Upon meeting Susan, I felt a real and immediate connection. She told me she only had 2 weeks to live, and it broke my heart to hear her story as we talked long into the night. She wanted answers from me, why she was dying, what her life had really been for. I stayed with her a few days, but I had to explain that I could not give her all the answers she needed. Leaving John and Susan to face the next few weeks is one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. They dropped me off at the port, and I was lucky enough to meet up with a truck driver who gave me a free lift all the way from Dover to London. I only had to walk 10 kilometres home to my squat, and I marched back, hardly able to believe the adventure that had just unfolded. Once again, I was able to cheat death, yet I lost so much along the way. Over the next few weeks, I settled back into my life in London, reflecting upon all the trials I had to face and all the wonderful people who came together to save my life. The longest march home is a winter I will never forget. The end. Well, that brings back some memories, all right. I hate the snow. I hate the cold to this very day. I hate it more than just about anything else, and that is one of the reasons why. I don't know how I survived, but hey, I did. I'm still here. Harder to kill than a rat, I suppose, but there you have it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. Thank you for tuning in today. A big shout out to all my friends up in the Hawke's Bay. Good to have you on board, and hope you're enjoying that beautiful part of the country. You know, you lucky sods have just about the best weather there is, and some fantastic places like Hastings and Napier and Gisborne and that, and I love going up there. I was lucky enough to get right round to Lotton Point at one stage in my life, and places like Mahia Peninsula, and wow, I just love those places so much. You know, it's such a beautiful part of the country. So welcome aboard, and to all my Wairarapa viewers, I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you again next week. Bye for now.